Let's say something about where we have arrived at so far in this series of lectures, in the first 3 lectures in the series, and where we aim to go in the final lecture in the series this evening. In the first lecture, we looked at Carl Schmitt as a political historian, stressing the importance of reading the great historiography of political thinkers. One can't fully understand Hobbes without Hobbes's Behemoth, his History of the English Civil War. One can't fully understand Hume without the History of England. And one also cannot assess Schmitt's political thought without looking at Schmitt's major histories from dictatorship to Nomus of the Earth, but also without looking at the 2 historical works that Schmitt composes under German National Socialism, Land and Sea from 1942, and State Composition and the Collapse of the Second Empire from 1934, the latter of which has yet to be published in English translation. In the second lecture, we looked at Schmitt as an historian of political thought, who writes the history of political thought through his concepts of political theology and through his criterion of friends and enemies. Schmitt selects figures in the history of thought either as friends with a relation of self-identification. So the friend is for Schmitt a kind of another myself, just as it is for Aristotle and for Cicero in the tradition of Occidental thought, which in Schmitt's own assessment seemingly grants Schmitt permission to import views of his own into his objects of analysis, something we'll return to this evening. Or Schmitt reads them on the one hand as friends or as enemies, whom Schmitt reads against their own utterances with an aim to incriminate the objects of his histories by self-incriminating testimony. In the third lecture last week, we considered the regulative ideals of both Carl Schmitt and Raymond Aron, looking at their views on freedom, standing behind their wishes in both domestic and international politics. Carl Schmitt was seen to have a view of collective freedom, tied to his defense of the so-called Nuremberg laws passed in Germany in 1935, in which the core of freedom was a kind of liberation from spiritual or confessional foreign rule, geistige Fremdherrschaft in Schmitt's terms, which Schmitt associated with a liberation from liberalism and freedom for the national group. Raymond Aron, by contrast, was seen to have a pluralist and liberal conception of specifically individual rather than collective freedom, in which individuals are assigned a kind of menu of personal, political, and social freedoms, ranging from freedom of assembly and freedom of conscience to economic freedom and the freedom to form social associations like autonomous villages or trade unions. In our lecture today, we will aim to say something about Schmitt and Aron's analyses of world order in the aftermath of the Second World War and about their views on decolonization. In March of 1962, at the age of 73, the year in which he would turn 74, but Schmitt had not yet had his birthday, in March of 1962, Schmitt found himself on lecture tour in Franco's Spain. Within a tight week, from Thursday 15 March to Wednesday 21 March, Schmitt would give 3 lectures. On 15 March 1962, a Thursday, Schmitt lectured in Pamplona at the Estudio General de Navarra. On 17 March 1962, a Saturday, Schmitt spoke at the University of Zaragoza at the invitation of Luis Garcia Arias. On Wednesday, March 21st, so less than a week after the first lecture, on Wednesday, March 21st, 1962, Schmitt would round out the series of lectures in Madrid, where Schmitt was on that day, on 21 March 1962, named an honorary member of the Instituto de Estudios Políticos, the Institute of Political Studies in Madrid, directed by Manuel Fraga Iribarne. Accepting this honorary fellowship, Schmitt delivered a valedictory lecture, and you have it on the kind of cover of the valedictory lecture on your handout. Schmitt delivered a valedictory lecture in his series El Orden del Mundo después la Segunda Guerra Mundial, the order of the world since the Second World War. Accepting the honorary fellowship at the Institute of Political Studies, Schmitt thanked his host for the evening. Quote, and this is the first citation on your handout. So if you flip open your handout, this is citation 1 with Schmitt's original followed by translation. Don Manuel Fraga has interpreted my work, this is a quote from Schmitt, Don Manuel Fraga has interpreted my work in a magisterial manner, with scientific penetration and perfect intellectual comprehension. He has spoken of my person and my fame with humane noblesse and generosity. The celebrated Instituto de Estudios Políticos of Madrid has honored me with a distinction which is already grand and brilliant in itself, and which is yet more so for the historical moment and the contemporary situation. I cordially thank the Instituto and its director, Don Manuel Fraga, and I accept such an honor as a sign of a friendship and of a sincere connection. I will bear the insignia with pride and conscious of its signification. A fluent speaker of Spanish, Schmitt delivered the lecture in Spanish, which was swiftly published in the Revista de Estudios Políticos, the house journal of the Institute of Political Studies, at which Schmitt was delivering the lecture, and that institute, the Institute of Political Studies, funded by the Francoist state, would, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, publish in Spanish translation Schmitt's works, not only from the post-war period, but also from the National Socialist period. So Schmitt published the lecture swiftly in the Revista de Estudios Políticos, the house journal of the Institute of Political Studies, at which Schmitt was delivering the lecture, as well as a separate pamphlet version, the cover of which is on the front of your handout, a separate pamphlet version of the lecture, which is today to be found in Schmitt's Nachlass, Schmitt's archive in Duisburg, and images of which are on the first and second pages of your handout. The valedictory lecture outlined nothing other than Schmitt's history of the Cold War, of international development, and of the United Nations, from the latter's founding in the 1940s up to the then present moment of March 1962. Both Carl Schmitt and Raymond Aron, in their books, lectures, and writings, deploy stadial concepts and stadial historical concepts. In one sense, one can see this from the titles and subtitles of their books and articles, as well as from the section headings internal to their books. Aron's main course of sociological lectures, as Radar has noted, Aron's main course of sociological lectures entitled Les étapes de la pensée sociologique, the steps or stages of sociological thought. Both Schmitt and Aron speak well and admiringly of Auguste Comte. The central section of Schmitt's lecture in Madrid on the order of the world since the Second World War, you can just see, maybe you can get out a kind of either a microscope or a kind of magnifying glass. You can see it. This is at the top of the handout. It's the three stages of the Cold War: monistic, dualistic, and pluralistic. It is there on the top of the handout. So it bears the title, The Three Stages of the Cold War: Monistic, Dualistic, and Pluralistic. And you can see that atop what is numbered as page 1 in your handout. Schmitt situates the seeds and onset of the Cold War within the Second World War itself. So in other words, the seeds of the Cold War for Schmitt are seeded in the Second World War. Quote, and this is the second citation on your handout, quote, already before the start of the Second World War, Schmitt noted in the central section of his talk, exactly on the 26th of April, 1939, the English Prime Minister, Chamberlain, declared in the House of Commons, with the motive of introducing obligatory military service, quote, and this is the second citation on your handout, the truth is that we do not have war, but still less do we have peace. During the Second World War, the juridical discussion of the Cold War was oriented around the idea of neutrality, Schmitt writes, and this is still citation 2 on your handout. Quote, this neutrality was parceled with new distinctions. It was relativized and dissolved more every time, but never abandoned completely. Its point of reference, the classical idea of juridico-international neutrality. Thus there arose intermediate phenomena like non-belligerence and the practice of measures short of war. The United States practiced this class of half or quarter neutrality until its frank entrance into the war, that is to say, until the declaration of war of Hitler in 1941. But as long as there exists full, half, or quarter neutrality, there will also exist full, half, or quarter war. This was the road towards an intermediate condition which already did not allow to be distinguished where peace ended and where war began. End quote. On this presentation, the seeds of the Cold War for Schmitt lie in American support of the British war effort against Nazism in the years 1939 to 1941. American quasi-neutrality on Schmitt's presentation is American quasi-bellicosity. It would seem to be a consequence of Schmitt's utterance here that had America not supported Britain with Lend-Lease and cash carry programs, the Cold War would never have arisen, on Schmitt's view. Schmitt continues his analysis with a look at the human basis of the order which emerged after the Second World War. On Schmitt's view, the presupposition of that order is grounded in the human rapport between Roosevelt and Stalin. In Schmitt's discussion of the formation of the post-World War II order, Schmitt omits mention of Churchill. Although Churchill often finds place in Schmitt's works from the opening pages of Roman Catholicism Political Form onward, but Churchill is markedly absent here. Schmitt narrates the events of the Tehran and Yalta conferences as if Churchill were absent. In this narrative, as we saw in the second citation, Chamberlain is a world historical figure present in Schmitt's world historical narrative, yet Churchill, who was still alive and sitting in Parliament in 1962, in Schmitt's accounting, is not such a world historical figure. Schmitt writes, and this is citation 3 on your handout, if you go to the handout citation 3, with the original followed by a translation, quote, "The friendship which united Roosevelt and Stalin and the common battle contra Hitler avoided the critical knowledge that Stalin, for his part, was already practicing against the United States a kind of intermediate condition between war and peace, which formed part of his strategy of revolutionary war. Thus began the first phase of the modern Cold War. We can qualify it as the monistic phase, as it was based on the idea that the political unity of the world existed already, au fond, in 1943, and that it was only necessary to lay aside some hindrances, like the Germany of Hitler, in order to finally realize universal peace and the New World Order. Since 1942, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union transformed itself into the basis of an entire system of world-spanning political constructions, which still today have their repercussions in many uncritical imaginations. In particular, the new Organization of Universal Peace, the UNO, the United Nations Organization, was established upon the problematic foundation of a friendship between Roosevelt and Stalin," end quote. Schmitt holds this first stage or phase of the Cold War to be the monistic phase, a brief phase of a world seemingly united. This phase for Schmitt, this phase, Schmitt contends, was no more than a prelude to a more divided and dualistic stage. Schmitt demarcates the first monistic stage of the Cold War as encompassing the years 1942, so the seeds are already there in the Second World War, 1942 to 1947, with the subsequent dualistic stage of the Cold War as extending from 1947 to Schmitt's present moment in 1962. Quote, and this is the fourth citation on your handout, "This first phase," Schmitt writes, "was no more than a prelude. Already in the year 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War, the Cold War entered its second phase. In distinction from the first stage, which was monistic, although in the sense, only in the sense of an illusory unity, there now appears a pronouncedly dualist or bipolar structure. It was no longer about a protagonist of world friendship observing neutrality, although partial, in a war that the other protagonist was making against a third power. Rather, an intense enmity arises between the two world powers, until now isolated, and which are the two firm columns of the world organization of the UNO, the United Nations Organization. The illusion of the unity of the world was shattered. Stalin totally changed his strategy of revolutionary war. In 1947, Stalin's spokesperson, Shadnov, proclaimed the doctrine of the two camps, that is to say, a total division of the entire world between the United States and the Soviet Union. According to the friend-enemy criterion, and between these two camps, an authentic neutrality would not be possible anymore," end quote. Schmitt pegs this dualistic moment to his notion of freedom, understood as collective freedom, which we discussed last week. Quote, and this is citation 5 on your handout, quote, "The dualism may permit a small degree of freedom of bloc, as a marginal phenomenon or exception without importance. But when the countries outside the blocs constitute by their quantity and their importance a third front, which represents an independent political power, the Cold War will enter into its third phase, third stage of the Cold War. The freedom of a dualistic world order, divided between Anglo-American and Soviet spheres of influence, in Schmitt's assessment, seems transitory and illusory at best, quote, a marginal phenomenon or exception without importance. Schmitt outlines his view that in 1962, with the split between Khrushchev and Mao and the gradual worsening of relations between the PRC and the USSR, the Sino-Soviet split, Schmitt writes, quote, and this is citation 6 on your handout, quote, "It seems that we are witnessing this said moment, and that the dualistic bipolar system of the world is replaced by a pluralistic multipolar structure. The moment merits, by consequence, a special analysis, end quote. The shift from a bipolar to a multipolar world order, for Schmitt, bears direct consequences on the politics of the United Nations, the politics of which had been set up in the earlier moment and grounded in its institutional structure, on Schmitt's account, on a presumed amity between the Soviet Union on the one hand and Britain, France, and the United States on the other, to say nothing of a China led by nationalists rather than led by the PRC. Quote, and this is citation 6 on your handout, quote, the fact that the world organization of the UNO is suffering an evident transformation is a symptom that the critical moment has arrived, Schmitt writes. Quote, and this is still citation 6 on your handout, this transformation evidences a change in the order of the world, resembling that of 10 years ago, since the brief prelude of the monistic illusion, the dualist phase of the Cold War, was characterized by the paralysis of the Security Council of the UNO, provoked by the permanent veto of the Soviet Union. Just up until February 1957, the Soviet Union placed its veto 80 times. Since then, it's already more than 100 vetoes. One has to take into account that the Security Council was supposed to be originally the true world political organ for guaranteeing the peace. And precisely this organ was converted into the scene of the Cold War, which the two world powers continued making even within this illustrious forum. In the year 1953, the United States was obliged to revoke a resolution that changed the procedure. Now it was the General Assembly who, in the place of the Security Council with a majority of 2/3, took the decisions for the security of world peace. It doesn't have great importance if this change corresponded to the originary character of the statutes. The fact is that, with the aid of this transference from the Security Council to the General Assembly, the UNO functions well enough, and the Soviet Union practically tolerates this system. With a view to the shifting politics of the United Nations in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Schmitt shifts his view toward decolonization. Decolonization, Schmitt emphasizes, has altered the character of the representation at the United Nations organization, not least within the General Assembly. Quoting this is citation 7 on your handout, with the eruption of these new members into the plenary assembly, the character of this organism of the UNO was also transformed. The majority of 2/3 was no longer with security in the hands of the United States. I will mention only the names of Algeria, the Congo, and Goa, in order to recall that which this signifies practically, end quote. With the mention of Algeria, we might turn back to the lectures which Schmitt gave in Pamplona and Saragossa in the days before this talk in Madrid, which we've just been discussing, and which are much better known than Schmitt's lecture on the order of the world, even if their contents as well as their context are often obscured. So congratulations, you've made it through the first of 3 parts of the talk. Schmitt opened his lecture in Madrid, which we have just been discussing, on 21 March 1962, with the claim that, quote, and this is citation 8 on your handout, my lecture, this is the lecture in Madrid, forms part of a cycle around the crucial problem of the Cold War, end quote. And that's citation 8 on your handout. What did Schmitt have to say in the first part of his lecture cycle? How did Schmitt's lecture tour in Franco's Spain begin in the prior and precedent week? In the earlier parts of his cycle, in the earlier lectures, Schmitt had also presented a stadial theory of historical development, not that from the monistic to the dualistic to the pluralistic order of the world mirrored in the United Nations and the politics of the General Assembly of the United Nations, but that of the partisan and guerrilla warfare from the 19th century to Schmitt's own post-colonial and anti-colonial present in 1962. On 15 and 17 March 1962, Schmitt laid out his stadial theory of partisan and guerrilla warfare, which ascends from Clausewitz at the first stage to Marx and Engels at the second stage, from Marx and Engels to Lenin at the third stage, from Lenin to Stalin at the fourth stage, from Stalin to Mao Zedong, a fifth stage, and from Mao Zedong to the French general Raoul Salan, for Schmitt, the highest stage of partisan warfare in 1962. At the highest stage of this stadial theory of the partisan, Schmitt pauses and delineates 4 criteria of partisan warfare are distinguished in his view. The 4 criteria being, and if you see this on the 9th part of your handout. The ninth quote on the handout is a Schmitt interview on Norddeutscher Rundfunk, North German radio, with one of the German translators of Mao, Joachim Schickel, who's a translator of Mao's poetry and a proponent of the Cultural Revolution, but also a radio host on German public radio, who interviews Schmitt and calls him onto his radio program 4 times between 1969 and 1980. And you see here Schmitt on the radio program summarizing his view of the partisan, the 4 criteria being irregularity, mobility, intensified political engagement, and a telluric or landed character. And you find that on citation 9 on your handout. Schmitt publishes these lectures, the lectures from his Francoist Spain tour. He publishes these lectures from the same week in Spanish at the end of 1962 and in German in early 1963, dating his forward in the German edition to February 1963. Schmitt opens his account of the stadial development of the theory of the partisan with an image of German warfare in the Second World War. Quote, and this is citation 10 on your handout. The Prussian army and the German army led by Prussia from 1813 through the early part of World War II, Schmitt writes, and this is citation 10 on your handout, furnished the classical example of a military organization that had repressed radically the idea of the partisan. The Prussian-German army that marched into Russia on 22 June 1941 did not conceive of partisan warfare. Its campaign against Stalin began with the maxim, troops will fight the enemy, marauders will be handled by the police. The first special directives regarding the fighting partisans came only in October 1941. In May 1944, scarcely 1 year before the end of the 4-year war, the first complete regulation of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces regarding partisan warfare was instituted, end quote. Here, Schmitt's narrative draws us back to our discussion in the first week of this lecture series. In his account of the First World War, as we saw in our first lecture together, Schmitt argued that it was not Prussian militarism, but rather Prussian liberalism, which cost Germany the victory in the First World War. Schmitt's account here of the Second World War runs in parallel to that earlier account, insofar as Schmitt is attributing German defeat on the Eastern Front, in part, to insufficient preparation and insufficient rigor in its counterinsurgency preparations. On Schmitt's view, again, it is not excessive Prussian or German militarism, but rather insufficient militarism that cost Germany victory in both world wars. Schmitt's opening focus on partisan warfare within the Prussian context occasions a return to Clausewitz within the frame of the Napoleonic Wars. Having opened with the Prussian incompatibility with partisan warfare in the 20th century, Schmitt notes that Prussia did have its momentary encounter with partisan warfare, namely with the Prussian resistance to the Napoleonic armies in late 1812 and 1813. Quote, and this is citation 11 on your handout. Nevertheless, once in its history, the Prussian soldier state had an acherontic moment. That was in the winter and spring of 1812-1813, when an elite group of general staff officers sought to unleash and control the forces of national enmity against Napoleon. The German war against Napoleon was no partisan war. Nevertheless, this short revolutionary moment has extraordinary significance for the theory of the partisan, end quote. This moment in 1812 to 1813 produced in Schmitt's assessment, quote, an extraordinary manifesto of partisan warfare, the Prussian Landsturm Edict of April 21st, 1813. Schmitt summarizes this edict as follows, and this is citation 12 on your handout, quote, every citizen, every Staatsbürger, according to the Royal Prussian Edict of April 1813, is obligated to resist the invading army with weapons of every type. Axes, pitchforks, scythes, and hammers are, in section 43 of the edict, expressly recommended. Every Prussian is obligated to refuse to obey any enemy directive and to injure the enemy with all available means. So axes, pitchforks, scythes, and hammers. Also, if the enemy attempts to restore public order, no one should obey, because in doing so, one would make the enemy's military operations easier. It is expressly stated that intemperate, unrestrained mobs are less dangerous than the situation whereby the enemy is free to make use of his troops. Reprisals and terror are recommended to protect the partisans and to menace the enemy. In short, Schmitt notes, this document is a Magna Carta for partisan warfare, end quote. And that's citation 12 on your handout. Schmitt situates his Clausewitz within this moment. Quote, and this is citation 13 on your handout, the young Clausewitz, Schmitt observes, knew the partisan from the Prussian insurrection plans of 1808 to 1813. In 1810 to 1811, he, Clausewitz, had given lectures on guerrilla warfare at the General War College in Berlin and was one of the most important military experts on guerrilla warfare, not only in a technical sense, but also in the deployment of light, mobile troops. Guerrilla warfare became for him, for Clausewitz, as for other reformers of his circle, above all a political matter in the highest sense, meaning precisely of a revolutionary character. Acknowledgement of armed civilians, of insurrection, of revolutionary war, resistance and rebellion against the existing order, even when embodied in a foreign regime of occupation, this was a novelty for the Prussian, something dangerous, which similarly fell outside the sphere of lawful states, end quote. Moving forward in his history of the stadial development of the theory of the partisan, Schmitt presents Marx and Engels and Lenin in succession to Marx and Engels as readers of Clausewitz and students of military strategy and military tactics. Quote, and this is citation 14 on your handout, Marx and Engels recognize that contemporary revolutionary war is no barricade war in the old style, Schmitt maintains. Engels in particular, who wrote many military treatises, always emphasized this. But he considered it possible that bourgeois democracy, with the help of universal suffrage, could create a proletarian majority in parliament and thus legally could turn the bourgeois social order into a classless society. Consequently, one could say that Marx and Engels also called for a completely non-partisan revisionism, end quote. In this sense, on Schmitt's presentation, Marx and Engels could be interpreted as supporting either the revolutionary and guerrilla conquest of power or the attainment of proletarian power by democratic and electoral means. Schmitt continues, not so with Lenin, who recognized the inevitability of force and bloody revolutionary civil war and state war, and thus also approved of partisan warfare as a necessary ingredient of the total revolutionary process. Lenin was the first to fully conceive of the partisan as a significant figure of national and international civil war, and he sought to transform the partisan into an effective instrument of the Central Communist Party, end quote. That's citation 14 on your handout. As with Marx and Engels, Schmitt portrays Lenin as a reader of Clausewitz. Lenin, Schmitt writes, quote, and this is citation 15 on your handout, Lenin was a great expert on and admirer of Clausewitz. Lenin had studied on war intensively during World War I, 1915, and in his notebooks he copied quotations in German and made comments in Russian with underscoring and exclamation marks. In this way, he, Lenin, created one of the most remarkable documents of world history and of intellectual history. One of the most remarkable documents of world history and intellectual history, which is just, from Schmitt's perspective, Lenin's notebook on Clausewitz. From a fundamental consideration of these quotations, marginalia, underscoring, and exclamation points, and Schmitt himself also puts exclamation points in the marginalia of his books, it is possible to develop a new theory of absolute war and of absolute enmity that has determined the age of revolutionary war and the methods of modern Cold War, end quote. From Lenin, the partisan concept is raised in Schmitt's view to a higher stage, so higher than Marx and Engels from Schmitt's perspective, via a consideration of absolute enmity and absolute war. And for Lenin, unlike for Marx and Engels, the interpretation is not open, at least from Schmitt's perspective, of a parliamentary accession of power. Advancing from Lenin to Stalin, in Schmitt's view, Stalin too, for Schmitt, advances partisan warfare to a higher stadial plane. Quote, and this is citation 16 on your handout, quote, Stalin succeeded in linking the strong potential of national and homeland resistance, the essentially defensive, telluric power of patriotic self-defense against a foreign invader, with the aggressivity of the international communist world revolution, end quote, and that's citation 16 on your handout. As Stalin improved upon Lenin, for Schmitt, beyond Stalin, Mao advanced the stadial development of the theory of the partisan. So the improvement upon Lenin for Stalin is the additive of the telluric character. To Schmitt's category of the partisan, Lenin added absolute enmity and absolute war. Stalin infused a spirit of national resistance and a kind of landed character. And Mao both grounded partisan warfare for Schmitt more thoroughly in the peasantry, which for Schmitt amounts to a stadial advance. It's a higher, if you go up to the peasantry rather than down from it, that's an advance for Schmitt. And Mao joined disparate modes of fighting from international war and civil war into a single march of partisan warfare. Quote, and this is citation 17 on your handout. It spans pages 7 to 8, numbered pages 7 to 8 on the handout. Quote, the greatest practitioner of contemporary revolutionary war became as well its most famous theoretician, Mao Zedong. Some of his writings are today required reading at Western war colleges. Since 1927, Mao had assembled experiences in communist actions and then used the 1932 Japanese invasion to develop systematically all modern methods of national and international civil war. The Long March from southern China to the Mongol border, this is still citation 17 on your handout, the Long March from southern China to the Mongol border began in November 1934. It covered approximately 12,000 kilometers and suffered enormous casualties. But it constituted a series of partisan achievements and experiences that culminated in the Chinese Communist Party becoming a peasant and soldier party with partisans at the core. It is a significant coincidence that Mao completed his most important writings in 1936 to 1938, that is, the same years in which Spain defended itself against a war of national liberation sponsored by the international communist movement. End quote, and that's citation 17 on your handout. Note that Schmitt, who is delivering his theory of the partisan precisely in Franco's Spain in 1962, situates Mao and Franco within the same historical moment and on the same plane of historical development. Moreover, Schmitt presents Franco's victory in the Spanish Civil War as an act of national self-defense against international communism. This is citation 17 on your handout, quote, the same years in which Spain defended itself against a war of national liberation sponsored by the international communist movement, end quote. In the terms of the second lecture in this series, in the lectures leading to the theory of the partisan, Schmitt reads Mao as a friend, which is to say, as an identification figure, as another myself, as an alter ego for Schmitt himself, and as another avatar of Schmitt's own position. One sees this in Schmitt's praise for Mao's account of the pluralistic image of a new nomos of the earth, as a writer sharing Schmitt's own geopolitics and geospatial theory, whereby the world is to be divided into different Großräume, different great spatial spheres of influence. Quote, and this is the long citation 18 on your handout. Quote, here lies the deepest origin of the ideological differences between Soviet Russian communism and Chinese communism. But it can also be traced to an inner contradiction in the situation of Mao, who linked a universal, absolute, global enemy lacking any territorial space, the Marxist class enemy, with a territorially limited real enemy against capitalist colonialism. It is the antithesis of one world, that is, a political unity of the earth and its humanity, and a plurality of Großräume, large spatial political spheres, which are rationally balanced internally and in relation to one another. In a poem entitled Kunlun, Mao depicted the pluralistic image of a new nomos of the earth. And here, Schmitt quotes from Mao's poem, in which Mao, as the poet, Mao the poet, imagines himself, Mao, situated above the globe. Quote, and this is still citation 18 on your handout. Quote, so this is Schmitt quoting Mao. If I could stand above the heavens, I would draw my sword and cut you, i.e. the earth, into three parts. One piece for Europe, one piece for America, one piece left for China. Then peace would rule the world, end quote. And it's ambiguous in that quotation where exactly South America, Africa, and Australia are to be found when Mao draws his sword. Summing up the ascent from Lenin to Stalin to Mao in his Stadial theory, Schmitt writes, during World War II, Stalin successfully linked the telluric partisan of the national homeland with the class enmity of international communism. In this respect, Mao was many years ahead of Stalin. Also in his theoretical consciousness, Mao took the formula of war as the continuation of politics even further than Lenin did. Mao's approach is as simple as it is effective. War has its meaning in enmity. Indeed, Schmitt continues, and this is citation 19 on your handout, quote, both the relation with the 9-1 ratio of Cold War and open hostilities, so 9 parts Cold War, 1 part open hostilities, as well as the deeper world political symptomatic significance of the division of Germany after 1945, are for us only examples to clarify Mao's political theory. Its core lies in the partisan, whose essential characteristic today is true enmity, end quote. Schmitt presents Mao as a teacher of partisan warfare. Indeed, Schmitt writes, French professional officers returning from Asia to Europe after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in the 1950s and the colonial relinquishment of French Indochina, quote, have spread Mao Zedong's fame as the most modern teacher of the conduct of war. Just as Schmitt presents Marx, Engels, and Lenin as students of Clausewitz, Schmitt presents General Raoul Salan, one of the generals who revolted against Charles de Gaulle in Algeria in the early 1960s with the aim of keeping Algeria under French colonial control. Schmitt presents General Raoul Salan as a perceptive student of Mao. Schmitt presents the overall stadial development of the theory of the partisan as being a movement from a colonel, Clausewitz, to a general, Salan. The general is higher than the colonel in rank, and Salan, for Schmitt, embodies and personifies the highest stage of Schmitt's view of partisan warfare. Quote, and this is citation 20 on your handout, Salan had become acquainted with modern partisan warfare in the forests, jungles, and rice fields of Indochina. Salan had learned firsthand that peasants could put a battalion of first-rate French soldiers on the run. Salan saw the squalor of refugees and became acquainted with Ho Chi Minh's underground organization, which the legal French administration overlooked and overplayed. With the exactitude and precision of a member of the general staff, Salan observed and scrutinized the new, more or less terrorist conduct of war. At the same time, it occurred to Salan that what he and his comrades called psychological warfare was, together with military technical action, part of modern warfare. Here, Salan readily could adopt Mao Zedong's system of thought, yet it is well known that he also had studied the literature concerning the Spanish guerrilla war resistance against Napoleon, end quote. Salan, for Schmitt, synthesizes what Schmitt the jurist admired in both Mao and in the Spanish resistance to Napoleon of the early 19th century. Raoul Salan was head of the Organisation d'Armée Secrète, the OAS, the secret army organization, which fought both the French army, the French and Algerian civilian populations, and the FLN, all with the aim of retaining Algeria as a French département and French colony. Schmitt writes of Salan and the OAS's activities, quote, open enmity against General de Gaulle began in 1960. In January 1961, a few of Salan's friends founded the secret army organization. Salan became its leader when, on April 23, 1961, Salan was called to join the officers' putsch in Algeria. When this putsch began to crumble on April 25, 1962, the OAS pursued systematic terrorist actions, systematic in the sense of so-called psychological warfare of modern mass terror, against both the Algerian enemy and the Algerian civilian population, as well as against the civilian population in France. The decisive blow against these terrorist actions concerned, this is still Schmitt quote, occurred in April 1962 when Salan was arrested by the French police. The trial before the highest military court in Paris began on May 15th and ended on May 23rd, 1962. The indictment specified an attempted forceful overthrow of the legal regime and the terrorist acts of the OAS between April 1961 and April 1962. So those are the charges against Salan. Since the court allowed for extenuating circumstances, Salan did not get the death penalty, which he might have received, but rather life in prison. Given General Raoul Salan's palpable failure and Mao's marked success, the reader or the auditor of Schmitt's lectures might ask, what is it in Schmitt's eyes that elevates Salan above Mao? Why does Salan occupy a higher place in Schmitt's stadial theory? Not least, Schmitt admired Salan's comportment at trial. The space which Schmitt gives, both within the lectures and within the book, to Salan's actions at his trial is greater than the space which Schmitt accords to Clausewitz, Marx, Engels, and Stalin combined. Schmitt admires in the first instance that Salan takes responsibility for his actions. Schmitt presents Salan at trial as saying, quote, Je suis le chef de l'OAS. Ma responsabilité est donc entière. I am the head of the OAS. My responsibility is therefore entire. No less, Schmitt admires that, for the most part, at trial, Salan keeps his silence. He doesn't name his co-collaborators. He doesn't reveal any witness testimony at trial. Quote, and this is citation 21 on your handout. Salan, as is Schmitt, speaking citation 21, Salan actually maintained his silence throughout the whole trial, even during the harsh and insistent questioning of the public prosecutor, who declared that Salan's silence was just a tactic. Finally, after the public prosecutor remarked on the illogic of Salan's silence, the president of the High Military Court said that even if this behavior could not be respected, it nevertheless could be tolerated and not treated as contempt of court, end quote. Schmitt admires both Salan's assumption of responsibility and Salan's silence in the face of the state prosecutor. Not least, Schmitt admires what Salan says before his sentencing. Quote, and this is citation 21 on your handout. Quote, when the trial was over, the president asked Salan if he had anything to say in his defense. Salan answered, I will open my mouth only to say, Vive la France. And to the prosecuting attorney, I say simply, Que Dieu me garde. May God defend me. Schmitt interprets this utterance as follows, quote, and this is still citation 21 on your handout. The first part of Salan's concluding remark, Vive la France, was directed to the president of the High Military Court, and he had in view the presumed death sentence. So the sentence hasn't been delivered yet, and he could get death. In this situation, at the moment of his execution, Salan would shout, Vive la France, as the guillotine comes down. The second part was directed to the prosecuting attorney and sounded somewhat oracular, orakelhaft in Schmitt's German. However, it is perfectly understandable that the public prosecutor, and this is still Schmitt, the public prosecutor suddenly became religious, although it was certainly unusual in a state that still practices laïcité. Not only did the public prosecutor characterize Salan's silence as arrogant and lacking in remorse, and as an attempt to plead extenuating circumstances for a milder sentence, suddenly he, the public prosecutor, spoke, as he expressly said, as a Christian to a Christian, un chrétien qui s'adresse à un chrétien, and told the defendant, Salan, that he, the public prosecutor, that Salan had forfeited the grace of God and incurred eternal damnation. To which Salan answered, Que Dieu me garde, may God defend me. Schmitt repeats Salan's injunction to the public prosecutor both with and without quotation marks, in effect repeating Salan's invocation of God's defense in propria persona, in Schmitt's own name. If we look back to the subject of our second lecture, to Schmitt's political theology, which favors a grounding of political thought in divine revelation, on Schmitt's interpretation of Salan, who invoked God's defense, or the defense of the divine at his trial, where Mao, in Schmitt's theory, becomes a mouthpiece for Schmitt's geopolitics, enunciating a new nomos of the earth in Mao's poem Kun Lun, Salan, for Schmitt, augments Mao's theory of the partisan with an appeal to the divine, which was absent in Mao, thus raising Salan, in Schmitt's eyes, above Mao by invoking God, Que Dieu me garde. For Schmitt, long a reader of J.N. Figgis, Salan becomes a kind of divine right avatar for partisan warfare, not least from Schmitt's perspective, for keeping Algeria under French control, albeit a French control other than that of the French Fifth Republic. That's the end of part 2. Congratulations, you made it about 70% of the way. The content of Schmitt's lectures on his lecture tour in Franco's Spain in March of 1962, and their dates and locations are not wholly unrelated. On 15 March 1962, as Schmitt lectured on his Stadial theory of the partisan in Pamplona, the OAS, headed by Raoul Salan, engaged in a killing spree against teachers attending a conference of the National Education Ministry who directed educative social centers in Algeria, lining 6 teachers up against the wall and shooting them in broad daylight on the same day. On 17 March 1962, as Schmitt lectured in Saragossa, the OAS, under Salan's command, engaged in a more general killing spree. Alistair Horn, in A Savage War of Peace, describes the situation in Algeria from February 1962 onward, under the circumstances of the OAS terror campaign, quote, Algiers alone was now averaging a rate of 30 to 40 killings a day, not to mention wounded, end quote. On the 18th of March, 1962, thus 3 days before Schmitt ended his lecture campaign and his lecture course, the avian agreements were signed for French withdrawal from Algeria. After the avian agreements, for Schmitt subsequently to reiterate his theory of the partisan in February 1963, thus in the year after the French withdrawal, in the aftermath of the French withdrawal from Algeria, amounted in effect to Schmitt's attempt at a retroactive justification of the terror campaign of the OAS and of General Salan to keep Algeria under French control. Schmitt's praise of Salan is the aperture of Raymond Aron's critique of Schmitt on the Partisan. Raymond Aron had been a proponent of granting independence to Algeria, then a French department, not solely a protectorate, not only in the Fifth Republic from 1958 onward, but also publicly in the Fourth Republic, publishing La Tragédie Algérienne, the Algerian Tragedy, which collected texts from 1956 and 1957 prior to de Gaulle's coup d'etat and the subsequent authorizing referenda, which initiate the French Fifth Republic in 1958. Raymond Aron thought, in the terms of his philosophy of history, that the processes of decolonization and the end to European overseas empires was and were inevitable, as Ian Stewart rightly points out in his monograph in the Ideas and Context series from 2019. Yet Aron also thought that negotiating with decolonial nationalists sooner rather than later favored liberalism and moderation internationally, and that counterinsurgencies to retain overseas imperial holdings tended to worsen both the lives of the colonized and the lives of the colonizers, as well as to radicalize the anti-colonial leadership, which within a Cold War context also, in Aron's estimation, tended to draw decolonial nationalisms into alliance with the Soviet Union. In addition to counterinsurgency operations within colonial spaces being ruinously expensive. Much better, on Aron's account, would be negotiated withdrawal and the liberal integration of former colonies into global markets and relations of commercial exchange. And this, for Aron, tended to work better the sooner it transpired. Aron reiterated his support for Algerian independence in a second pamphlet, Algérie et la République, published in 1958, shortly after de Gaulle's seizure of power and the onset of the Fifth Republic. It is perhaps a matter of curiosity in Schmitt's theory of the partisan, the print version, published in 1963, precisely in the passage in which Schmitt praises Raoul Salan, this is citation 22 on your handout, precisely in the passage where Schmitt praises Raoul Salan, the general who headed the OAS, that Schmitt would cite Aron in summing up the passage on Salan. Schmitt cites Aron directly in the footnote affixed to citation 22 on your handout. So there's citation 22, and there's a footnote to Raymond Aron's Paix et guerre entre les nations, peace and war amongst the nations. And the passage Schmitt cites is to Aron's Peace and War Amongst the Nations, his study of international affairs of 1962, which is citation 24 on your handout. So that's precisely the page that Schmitt cites. There, in the passage that Schmitt cites, Aron writes, quote, and this is citation 24 on your handout, "Partisans are incapable of defeating regular armies, but they render maintenance of order costly and pacification impossible. Once the prestige of the conquerors has vanished, the number of the colonized inevitably overwhelms the superior equipment of the colonists, so that by a strange paradox, étrange paradoxe, the latter are obliged to mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers against several thousand guerrillas. Had they reflected on the meaning of these figures, statesmen would have had no doubt as to the outcome," end quote. Schmitt cites this passage, which for Aron was meant to support granting independence to Algeria, and indeed sooner rather than later. Schmitt cites this passage precisely from Schmitt's perspective to defend Raoul Salan and the OAS in their counter-terrorist and overtly terrorist campaign against the Algerian population. It is precisely the étrange paradoxe, the strange paradox, which Aron outlines, in which Schmitt, if you look at Schmitt's German, he actually cites the étrange paradoxe is in French. So it's a direct citation from Aron. He's taking Aron's words and using them against Aron's position. It is precisely the strange paradox which Aron outlines, which on Schmitt's accounts motivated the OAS's actions and the invocation of the divine on their behalf. Recurring back to our earlier lectures together in this series, in which we outlined Schmitt's Ciceronian rhetorical strategy of turning the weapons and words of his opponents and enemies against those opponents and enemies themselves, Schmitt takes the words and phrases of Aron, an advocate on economic and liberal grounds of Algerian independence, and deploys them to explain and defend the actions of Raoul Salan and the OAS. And one can see that in citation 22 on your handout, where the quote from Aron appears in French in Schmitt's German original, to which an explicit footnote to Aron, to what is now citation 24, is also affixed. This intellectual maneuver on Schmitt's part, the use of Aron's political vocabulary, which accompanies the correspondence, so actually written correspondence of letters, exchange of letters, between Schmitt and Aron in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, is one which Aron found plainly unacceptable, inacceptable. And one can see that on citation 23 of your handout, that Aron finds this unacceptable. Aron's magisterial late work, Thinking War, Clausewitz, Penser la guerre, Clausewitz, from 1976, that would require a lecture series of its own to interpret. And yet, that work issues, it culminates in a way, in an analysis and critique of Schmitt's theory of the partisan, which is worth briefly delineating and delimiting. At least in part, it is Schmitt's appropriation of Clausewitz and of Aron's own political and international thought for the Nazi jurists' defense of the OAS and defense of Raoul Salan, which moves Aron to offer a counter-interpretation of Clausewitz that issues in a critique of Schmitt, a critique of Salan, and in a critique of the theory of the partisan. Aron's magisterial Clausewitz book is thus a direct response to Carl Schmitt. Quote, and this is citation 23 on your handout, quote, readers who know the books of Carl Schmitt, this is Raymond Aron, readers who know the books of Carl Schmitt, Aron writes at the denouement of the penultimate chapter of his Clausewitz book in the second volume, it's citation 23, readers of Carl Schmitt would have recognized in the preceding pages, i.e. in everything that comes before, so in about 500 pages of what comes before, ideas close to his, or even a different interpretation of the same themes. Thus, Aron continues, quote, it seemed necessary to me to mark the points of divergence which touch precisely upon the concept of the partisan, end quote. Aron's critique tracks Schmitt's presentation of the partisan. Just as Schmitt had outlined both a conceptual account, and we get that in citation 9, that's the Norddeutscher Rundfunk account, the 4 criteria of the partisan, the mobility, irregularity, political engagement, and telluric or landed character of the partisan, the 4 criteria, alongside a stadial genealogy that culminates in the 4 criteria. The stages ascending from Clausewitz via Marx and Engels, via Lenin, via then Stalin, then Mao, then Salan. So you have both a genealogy and a criterial account of the partisan. Aron critiques Schmitt on the partisan both conceptually in terms of the 4 criteria and genealogically. So it's both Aron's critique mirrors Schmitt's presentation. Conceptually, Aron takes Schmitt by his 4 criteria of partisan warfare: irregularity, mobility, intensified political engagement, and the telluric or landed character of the partisan, which we had on citation 9 of the handout. Aron contends that not all of these characteristics are always conjoined in the partisan. For example, mobility and landedness can come apart, as well as irregularity and political engagement. So if you're engaged politically, you're an activist, you're waving a sign, it hurts your irregularity, i.e. not wearing a uniform. And those criteria may cut against one another, Aron contends, in a relation of strained tension. So not always do all the criteria that Schmitt presents go together. That's Aron's critique. Moreover, Aron contests Schmitt's stadial narrative by challenging the ideas which Schmitt attributes to the figures in his history of partisan warfare. As we noted in the second lecture, Schmitt treats figures in the history of political thought, whom he regards as friends, as identification figures. It is precisely this which Aron objects against Schmitt's narrative, ascending from Clausewitz via Marx and Engels to Lenin, ultimately to Salan. Quote, with regard to Lenin's contribution to the theory of absolute war and of absolute enmity, which Carl Schmitt analyzes, Aron writes, quote, in the Clausewitz book, it suffers from ambiguity because the German jurist substitutes for the notions of the authors, Clausewitz or Lenin, his own notions. So Schmitt, on Aron's account, reads his own positions into the objects of his historical analysis. Moreover, Aron argues there is not one singular form of the partisan to be theorized. Partisans, guerrillas, and resistance fighters have plural attributes and different aims in different contexts. There is no singular theory of the partisan, from Aron's perspective, comparable to a form of the good. Not least, however, Aron objects to Schmitt's valorization of Raoul Salan. This, Aron contends, is a properly stupefying error, erreur proprement stupéfiante. And here, too, Aron reverses Schmitt's testimonial strategy. So in effect, Aron takes Schmitt's testimonial strategy and turns it against Schmitt himself. With regard to Salan, Aron argues, he bears testimony to the cardinal error against which Clausewitz puts one on guard and which Carl Schmitt does not always avoid, defining combat or a combatant by a method. Obsessed by the procedures, terrorism and counterterrorism, parallel organizations, coexistence of clandestine administration and of the legal administration, the French colonels imagined that one may turn the procedures of the partisans against the partisans. General Salan, Aron continues, defended an empire, in Indochina as well as in Algeria. The defender of an empire, he found himself without allies in a world in which anti-colonialism dominated. In 1961, General Salan had to obey a government legalized and at the same time legitimized, so you have legality and legitimacy, legalized and at the same time legitimized by the referendum and the election of 1958. Salan transformed into the head of the partisans against the legal government of France, against the French authorities and the FLN in Algeria, slid into a tragic buffoonery, vers une bouffonnerie tragique. Here, Aron has turned Schmitt's categories of legality and legitimacy back against Salan and against the Nazi jurist, defending the 1961 terror campaign for a French Algeria. To sum up, you've now made it through all three parts of the lecture. To sum up, at the end of last week's lecture, we considered Schmitt and Aron's views on freedom as paths to considering their posthumous receptions and as paths to considering their international thought. In particular, we noted that Schmitt's view of collective freedom was subject to post-colonial and anti-colonial appropriation in ways in which Aron's liberal and pluralist view of individual freedom seemingly did not facilitate. In view of Schmitt's praise of Raoul Salan and his positioning of the head of the OAS as the pinnacle of partisanship, the height of the theory of the partisan and guerrilla warfare, and even in Schmitt's assessment, terrorism waged for the express end of Algérie Française, we might wonder again about how Schmitt came to be appropriated in critical theory as well as in post-colonial studies. In part, we may suggest, by way of conclusion, it has been the critical portion of Schmitt's project, rather than the positive or substantive portion of Schmitt's project which has been received. The categories of the political, of political theology, and of the partisan have been taken up, whilst stripped of the reference which Schmitt accords to them. Schmitt's criticisms of liberalism, of the British and American governments overseas, for their overseas acquisitions, are more pronounced than Schmitt's advocacy of the empires and imperial projects which Schmitt himself favored, from the German invasion of Belgium in 1914 to the Nazi invasion of Poland, Denmark, and the Netherlands and France at the outset of the Second World War, to the general's putsch against de Gaulle to keep Algeria French, albeit under a French rule administered otherwise in the French Fifth Republic. Perhaps it is then best to end on a cautious note that historical reconstruction of thinkers of the past within the plenitude of their texts and contexts, while perhaps less immediately exhilarating than theoretical appropriation of thinkers of the past for contemporary ends, may yet offer the safer as well as the more scholarly course. Thank you.
Could you say a bit more about how Schmitt's ideas were appropriated by seemingly...
Yeah, so I think, so there is a kind of a broad, not always solely left appropriation of Schmitt, but there's a kind of appropriation of Schmitt in the Italian Communist Party, or people breaching off from the Italian Communist Party in the 1970s. That's Tronti, Carlo Galli, that's Giorgio Agamben in part, it's also Negri. So people who are to the left of the Italian Communist Party in the 1970s want a critique of capitalism that is not bound up with the institutional compromises that they see as associated with the Italian Communist Party in Italy. That's one. But there's also an appropriation of Schmitt by the New Left Review in the late 90s, early 2000s, both by Perry Anderson, but also by Gopal Balakrishnan. Those would be two examples of a kind of left appropriation of Schmitt. But you also see that in Alain Badiou as well, in many, many works, because Badiou is very prolific. Those would be three, let's say, cases. And Badiou is also Maoist, right? So the kind of, the praises of Mao ring resoundingly within Maoist ears, right? So this high praise of Mao. Also Schickel, who, if you go to quotation 9 on your handout, Schickel in a way begins that even earlier. He invites Schmitt onto his radio program, and the first of those interviews, the first of the 4 interviews, is published in this little yellow book called Guerrillas and Partisans. It's a German publication, and they collect excerpted revolutionary manifestos, but beginning with the dialogue between and the interview between Schickel and Schmitt. And that's a kind of, you'd say, maybe kind of part of the onset moment of this kind of left reception of Schmitt, a kind of RAF reception of Schmitt, so reception of Schmitt by the Baader-Meinhof gang. I don't know if that speaks to the question or thought.
Just follow on. Did Derek Hobsbawm, did he have anything to say about Carl Schmitt?
So I don't have a Hobsbawm. I'm not a Hobsbawm scholar, but I don't have a Hobsbawm quote on Schmitt. You could also see why Hobsbawm wouldn't be interested in that. You know, that wouldn't be the Hobsbawm line.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, having followed before, sort of what you conclude on Schmitt. So you present him very much as an illiberal thinker, and that unites both the bellicist and the kind of crypto-theological strand. So you can understand that from the point of view of liberal legal order, both a theocratic justification of power and a sort of overtly bellicist discourse would be outside of what is allowed. But of course there could be a tension between these two motives, because the logic of bellicism is somehow that war is autotelic, so it's not only self-legitimizing, but it doesn't serve any other purpose. So it might use various purposes on its way. So it starts with nationalism, and then other things may come along that you sort of ad hoc present. But obviously, as the war continues, all these are constantly empty. So bellicism sort of ends up being quite closed as a discourse, and it sort of just destroys all purpose. Whereas, of course, if you're a Catholic, that's not possible, because even though there are dark figures in the history of Catholicism who defend all sorts of wars, as a doctrine, it's about the Church. And the Church is not autotelic. I mean, it's an institution that is justified by all sorts of other purposes that it ostensibly advocates. So, what do you think? Isn't there a tension between Church and war in Schmitt?
So Schmitt's church would be an ecclesia militans, right? So it would be a militant church, right? So but he would want to say that he would oppose within ecclesiological discussions those who, in his view, want to turn Christianity into a pacifist organization, right? So that's kind of his language, right? So those who make Christianity into pacifist. We had that in the first lecture in these quotations from Schmitt's interpretation of this 1916 poem, Das Nordlicht, the Northern Light. And one of the things that leads actually to the First World War, to the outbreak of the war, is Christians thinking that Christianity just means pacifism. And that actually leads to war, oddly, for Schmitt's perspective. So Schmitt actually also has an article that says Frieden oder Pazifismus, so peace or pacifism. In other words, peace, which you might achieve through war, is not to be attained via pacifism. Right? In other words, pacifism doesn't lead to peace. So in that sense, war for Schmitt has a goal, and it's war for peace, right? Just as it is in Aristotle, but also in Aquinas, right? It has a telos, which is outside itself for Schmitt's, but it would be a better one, especially if it leads to a greater and a better peace. I don't know if that speaks.
I'm not sure that comes out, because in the way you talk, there is a logic to his thinking, which is very, it's not only polemical and opportunistic, as we've talked about, but also it's so radical that it seems to not tolerate any substantial normative purpose. They would all be kind of eroded by this, the sharpness of his kind of existentialism. There's always an element of just pure conflictuality, which would just burn any other purpose. So I just can't see that you can say that there's a purpose external to war, really.
So I suppose the question would be for Schmitt. So Schmitt, in terms of he takes, so he defends the Crusades. So in one case, he defends the Crusades. He also defends the colonization of the Americas. And he says the best defense of that colonization is Christianization. Right? He says that in Land and Sea. Right? So he says that's actually a real defense. And the other defenses are just legal maneuver. But for Schmitt, that is actually defense. So, and similarly, he defends Salan, but not the French Fourth Republic. Right? So in other words, and Salan, it's a Christian. Schmitt reads it as a kind of Christian colonization, right? So it's Christians over Muslims, Christian rule over Muslims. That, from Schmitt's perspective, would be defensible, right? And that unites, in a way, the bellicosity and the ecclesiology, and that the move there. In Theory of the Partisan in the 60s is the same move in the 40s in Land and Sea to say, well, Christianization would be a justification for an imperium. So the question is, there may yet, nonetheless, as you rightly point out, there may be tensions and there may be internal contradictions in the view, but in terms of the tendency of what Schmitt wants to argue, is something like, you don't get peace from pacifism. Christianity itself and Christianization would itself be a justification of war. And the exclusion of Jews and Muslims from the community, that's also the same, in effectively the same position, right? That he wants a kind of Christianized Reich in the 30s. I don't know if that speaks to the idea or?
Well, it's a good answer. I don't know enough to know if I'm convinced, but I understand.
Other questions or?
Going back to the 30s, but the National Socialists were Hitler et al. Were hostile to Christianity. Therefore,
right. So there are concordances. So there's a concordance signed in 33, in the early months of 33, between Hitler's Reich and the Roman Catholic Church. It is only after the concordance is signed that Schmitt joins the Nazi Party. There is similarly a concordance between Mussolini and the Church. Only after which, i.e. to respect the rights of the church. It's a kind of formal contract. And there are aspects of this concordance, it's a treaty law, which are still in force today. So in this great university, we have Regis professorships, or like the Mastership of Eton, the Mastership of Trinity College, Cambridge. Those were crown appointments. According to the concordance from the early 1930s of Hitler, the German Reich, with the Roman Catholic Church, there are professorships set up in German universities. So Lehrstuhl 1, for example, in philosophy in Munich, is a Konkordatslehrstuhl, and there are Konkordatslehrstühle, there are plural, many of them. So just like Regis professorships, going back to your good question, they're set up by this treaty, they're still in force today, right? So 90 years later, they're still there. So go, for example, in Regensburg, the chair in political philosophy in Regensburg, also in Erlangen, requires to this day the countersignature of the bishop, not the countersignature of a prime minister, countersignature of a bishop for you. So if you want to apply, the bishop has to agree. The local bishop has to agree. That is in Hitler's agreement with the Roman Catholic Church. Only after that agreement is made does Schmitt join the Nazi Party. So in other words, we have a view of the Nazi Party, and this goes back to your excellent question. We have a view, and it may be a good view, good textbook view. The Nazis are social Darwinists. They believe in the conquest of more powerful things over less powerful things, but not everyone who signs up for it believes that. And Schmitt doesn't sign up to Darwinism. He's an anti-Darwinist, right? So he doesn't believe in biology. He also criticizes it. So if you read Land and Sea, Schmitt's book, he doesn't even accept modern chemistry. He accepts the elements, the four elements, so land, sea, air, and fire. Those are the elements Schmitt believes in. He doesn't believe in oxygen, these kind of things. So his chemistry is not modern chemistry. And his biology is not modern biology, so it's not Darwinian biology. Schmitt accepts the creation story. And you see that both in the dialogue on New Space, where Schmitt lays out in a dialogue between a historian and a chemist. The historian defends Genesis, and the chemist defends modern chemistry, and Schmitt's view is on the side of the historian who defends Genesis. So Schmitt is a Nazi, but not on Darwinian grounds. And I know that may complicate our view of what Nazism is, but no less, Schmitt only joins the Nazi Party after Hitler signs the concordance. Right? So there is actually a formal legal agreement between the Roman Catholic Church and the Nazi Party and the German state, and that precedes Schmitt's Nazism, at least his formal engagement with the party. I don't know if that's speaking to your question or thought.
Yes, I was sort of aware of that, but I thought it would have been obvious to some that the treaty that Hitler entered was tactical to
So it's tactical,
to reduce resistance.
right? But also it not only reduces resistance, it adds adherence, right? So there are German Catholics, right? And some of them are militant Catholics, including this one.
Right. Thank you.
I don't know if that other questions or thoughts.
I guess pursuant to that, Hitler lost the Catholic vote in Germany, which was a substantial vote, as you just suggested, by a huge margin. And the only areas he won were like East Prussia and Brandenburg, areas where they were overwhelmingly Protestant, and then the Center Party, cleaned up the Catholic vote. Surely the tension there between some of the German bishops and Hitler, the Archbishop of Cologne putting Stars of David on the statues of Christ and Mary, to sort of emphasize their Jewishness. So these tensions had to have bothered Schmitt to some degree, right?
So Schmitt is kicked out of. So Schmitt has, in relation to his personal life, he does not support his own excommunication. Schmitt is excommunicated for his personal life, there's a description of this in Reinhard Mehring's Schmitt biography, Aufstieg und Fall. Schmidt's first wife is a courtesan, and Schmitt, and she, in marrying her, she had falsified noble ancestry. So her name is von der Rotich, and Schmitt takes that up, and so there are actually early texts, the early editions of Political Romanticism and of Dictatorship are published by Schmitt von der Rotich. So he takes up this kind of the German von, so he adopts the nobility of her name, but it's a falsified noble ancestry. Schmitt proposes that as the ground for divorce, so he married her under false pretenses. The civil authorities accept it, and the church authorities don't accept it. Schmitt goes to canon law, and he loses in canon law. He goes to civil law, and he wins in civil law. So he's civilly divorced, but then when he remarries after his first marriage, the church does not accept it, and he's excommunicated for extramarital concubinage. The excommunication is lifted when the second wife dies. So Schmitt doesn't wish to be excommunicated, but he is then, and he protests his own excommunication. I mean, he fights it, but he doesn't publicly complain. But that also means that he's kicked out and cannot stand as a candidate or as a member of the Center Party, and he moves rightward. So it's partially his own fraught relation to the political end of the Center Party, in part, that opens the space for these types of things. And so it's both a theological view, but it's a theological view untethered from the church, but still, in effect, thinking that it has worldly authority, although in his own case it's made a mistake. It's absolute and infallible, but sometimes making mistakes. Which he also says in relation to canonizations. So in his notes on Bellarmine, Bellarmine is canonized in Schmitt's lifetime, and Schmitt says, Bellarmine, that's a false theology. Bellarmine shouldn't be canonized. But the Pope is infallible, and the Pope has canonized Bellarmine. What are we to do with this situation? And that parallels his own situation in his excommunication. He doesn't think he should be excommunicated, but he has been, and he has to accept it. And he also has to accept Bellarmine's canonization, even though he knows Bellarmine has a false theology, and he has a better one, in his view. Yeah, so thank you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.